True Crime Brewery contains disturbing content related to real-life crimes. Medical information is opinion based on facts of a crime and should not be interpreted as medical advice or treatment. Listener discretion is advised.
My name is Mary Lyons. I'm the banking center manager. We have a lady who is in our bank right now who says that her husband and children are being held at their house. The people are in a car outside the bank. She is getting $15,000 to bring out to them that if the police are told, they will kill the children and the husband. Her name is Jennifer Petit, P-E-T-I-T.
Okay, she's still in the bank?
Yes, she is.
Okay, she's being held. Her husband and family's being held?
Yes.
At their house?
Yes. They're tied up. She said they drove her here. I'm trying to look and see where she's gone. She went outside, but I don't... Oh, wait, I see her walking now. She is petrified.
Welcome to True Crime Brewery. I'm Jill.
And I'm Dick.
The day of July 22nd, 2007 had been a typical Sunday for the Petit family of Cheshire, Connecticut. But on that summer day, a convicted felon out on parole noticed mother Jennifer Hawke-Petit and her 11-year-old daughter Michaela shopping at a neighborhood grocery store. Michaela had taken an interest in cooking, and she was choosing ingredients for the family dinner she was going to prepare that night. After following the mother and daughter home, the convict and another career criminal plotted out a ruthless home invasion for the Petit home. They would return later that night, terrorizing the family and leaving all but one family member murdered and their house in flames. Join us at the quiet end for the Cheshire Murders. The murders of Jennifer and her two daughters, Michaela and Hayley, occurred after hours of torment and sexual assault. By the time husband and father, Bill Petit, was able to escape to get help, it was too late. This crime left the town of Cheshire shocked and disturbed. After the story made the national news, people were unsettled by these seemingly random acts of evil perpetrated on a family in their own home. Today we're talking about the horrors endured by the Petit family, Bill Petit's unimaginable loss, the backgrounds of the two killers, and the police response, which many have criticized.
Today's beer is from Two Roads Brewing Company in Stratford, Connecticut. This is unorthodox Russian Imperial Stout. It's 9.2% alcohol by volume. This beer is a very dark brown color with a light tan head, nice aroma, some roasted malt, chocolate, and rye. A little bit of a surprise with the rye, but it really added to it. The taste was dark chocolate, espresso, and rye. And thanks to the rye, there's just a hint on the spicy side. Nice beer.
Sounds good. Let's open it up.
Okay.
All right, Dickie, bring that beer on down here to the quiet end, and you can start us out in our discussion today. I think before we start, a little warning, I find this case very harsh, very disturbing, just so you know.
Well, it is a disturbing case. It's one of those nightmares you would have as a parent, husband, or spouse.
Or anyone, yeah. It's a lot of people's worst nightmare.
Home invasion is just horrible.
It is really horrific, so just so you know, it's going to be a tough one. And you get us started.
Okay. We'll start out with a little background. So Dr. William Petit, who was an endocrinologist by profession, grew up in Plainville, Connecticut. His father was pretty well known in the community, and he ran a general store. Bill was a basketball player in high school, and he was one of the best students in his class. After graduation, he went to Dartmouth College and then medical school at the University of Pittsburgh. Now, when he met his future wife, Jennifer Hawke, she was a nurse at Children's Hospital in Pittsburgh, and he was a third-year resident. They began dating, and their relationship moved forward quickly and became serious. She was popular in high school and was a good student, starred in many of the school plays, and was a high achiever.
So the Petits were married in 1985 after Bill's residency at the hospital had ended. But because he only had 6 days off, they honeymooned in Meadville, Pennsylvania. Not a real happening place for a honeymoon. And that's where Jennifer's father was a Methodist pastor. Bill then received a fellowship at Yale, and he and Jennifer moved to Branford, Connecticut, where Jennifer took a nursing position in New Haven, where she would work her way up to the head nurse of a pediatric floor. Now, she had experience already in that. She was actually a pediatric oncology nurse when she met Bill. So these are pretty accomplished people, but by all accounts, very down-to-earth people as well. So in 1989, Jennifer was pregnant with their first child, Hayley, and that's when the couple bought their home in an upper-middle-class neighborhood of Cheshire. The house they bought on Sorghum Mill Drive seemed like an ideal place to raise a family. It was a very nice home, but it wasn't ostentatious at all. It was a middle-class home. As a former high school basketball star, Bill really couldn't wait to share this passion for the sport with his new daughter. So he took her to games before she was even 2 years old. And by the time she was 12, she was a pretty skilled player herself. Hayley was actually very athletic, and Hayley and Bill were close, and they would spend hours playing one-on-one together in their yard. Hayley was very tall, very sporty. She even played golf with her dad from time to time, and the two also liked to do gardening together. The Petit's second child, Michaela, was born 6 years after Hayley. In the summer of 2007, Michaela was 11 years old. She played basketball, lacrosse, and soccer at her school, and she really loved music, and one of her big things was that she liked to watch cooking shows like The Rachel Ray Show, and she liked to cook.
So Dr. Petit was the medical director of the Diabetes Center and the director of the Endocrinology, Metabolism, and Diabetes program at the Hospital of Central Connecticut. He also had a private practice in Plainville, Connecticut. Now, the Petit family seemed to be living charmed lives, but it wasn't perfect. Jennifer had multiple sclerosis, and this is a progressive neuromuscular disease, which can be disabling and which has no cure. So let me take a couple minutes just to talk about Dr. Petit's specialty.
Sure.
And MS. He was an endocrinologist, and that's near and dear to my heart because that's what I did my training in pediatrics in. After pediatric residency, I went on to do a 2-year endocrinology fellowship. So this is a study of diseases of the glands, basically the body. Pituitary gland, thyroid gland, pancreas, where insulin's produced, the adrenal glands, calcium metabolism. I always found it very interesting.
Well, yeah, you must have, because you spent a lot of time on it.
I did. The differences between a pediatric endocrine person and an adult endocrine person, both specialties will see a lot of diabetes. The difference with adults is they'll see a lot of type 2 as well as type 1. And in pediatrics, we'll see primarily type 1 diabetes, although type 2 is starting to inch up there in terms of kids being affected.
Well, yeah, what's the difference there, and why is that?
Type 1 diabetes is a lack of insulin. So what happens is an autoimmune process destroys the beta cells that produce insulin. So type 1 diabetes is a lack of insulin. Type 2 diabetes, you have insulin, but it doesn't work the way it should. You have unresponsive tissue to the insulin. So treatment in type 1 obviously is to replace the body with insulin. Treatment in type 2 involves weight loss, usually oral medications to help the insulin that's there, get it to work better, that type of thing. And the other thing we'll see in pediatrics a lot more often than in adults is kids that are short.
Okay, and a little bit about MS?
Well, other than saying that it is a progressive neuromuscular disease, and what happens is that it's also one of those darn autoimmune diseases. In this case, it's an autoimmune disease where the myelin, or the sheath covering the nerve cells, is attacked and doesn't work well. So you have all these neuromuscular problems that can stem from that.
Well, which basically means that all your functioning just kind of slips away.
Yeah.
I know there are various intensities and speeds at which this works, though. I've known different people with it who seem absolutely normal. And then as a nurse, I've taken care of people who can't even speak.
Yeah, there's a wide range of signs and symptoms.
Yes.
Although the end result is the same. At some point, you're going to lose a lot of bodily functions.
Right, yeah. So it's a sad thing to have.
It is. I mean, it's nice. A lot of people have a kind of a relapsing form, so in between relapses, you're basically fine. And then you have difficulty when you relapse, but you come out of that and you're okay again. Although, again, the end result is not great.
Yeah, because it's always progressive.
It is a progressive disease, that's right.
But in this case, with Jennifer, she was living a pretty normal life. She was doing okay. It was early on.
Yeah, she wasn't very much affected by it.
No, not yet. At least not that we know of. But it was something that would definitely be on your mind, and the diagnosis brought the family closer together. Hayley, the older daughter, organized a fundraising walking team to raise money for MS research because there's no cure, and she called it Hayley's Hope. So over a 7-year period, Hayley's Hope raised over $55,000. Then when Hayley graduated from high school, she passed on the fundraising team to Michaela, and Michaela changed its name to Michaela's Miracle because, she needs to claim it now.
That's right. Well,
yeah.
She's in charge, right?
Right. So these just seem like good kids.
They do. So Sunday evening, was July 22nd in 2007. That's when 26-year-old Joshua Kamasarjevsky saw Jennifer Hawke-Petit and her 11-year-old daughter Michaela shopping at the Stop and Shop grocery store. Stop and Shop was the largest store in the Maplecroft shopping plaza. There is also a Rite Aid pharmacy, a Subway, and a Bank of America. So Kamasarjevsky would later say that he had been at the Stop and Shop and he was waiting for a contractor to come in and give him payment for work that he had done as a roofer. And he noticed Jennifer and Michaela. So Kamasarjevsky was likely attracted by a sexual interest in Michaela and probably also by the apparent wealth of the family. So he followed them. As Jennifer drove her white Mercedes toward their home, he followed along behind them. Jennifer pulled into the driveway of the family home of Sorghum Mill Drive and entered the attached garage. Now, the home was worth over $400,000, and it was set back from the road, surrounded by trees. So to Kamasarjevsky, this place would have looked perfect for a home invasion.
Yeah, so he has a history that we'll get into that would make us think he was actually looking at the young girl here, which is disturbing. Now, that evening, Michaela made dinner for her family, and it was this delicious pasta dish, which they all enjoyed. And after dinner, Jennifer and the two girls watched a TV show, and then Michaela was reading a Harry Potter book, and Bill Petit fell asleep on a couch on the sun porch while reading some reports for work. So now I'm going to go into a little bit about Kamasarjevsky's background and criminal history. He was born to a teen mom in 1980, and he was adopted by a family who was very religious. As a child, Kamasarjevsky was sexually molested by his adopted brother, who was 10 years older. In the 1990s, his sister accused him of sexually assaulting her, and later his adopted father would say that he believed that was true. But if he knew this, why didn't he do anything about it? This seems very bad.
Yeah, this is all in retrospect, right?
Yes.
Nothing from the father or the parents going forward. This is all looking backwards.
So he committed his first burglary when he was just 14 years old. And in 2002, he was arrested for committing a string of 18 home invasions. So Kamasarjevsky told the defense attorney that he would rob the houses and then spend time going to the occupants' bedrooms and just stand there and listen to them breathe. So how creepy is that?
To me, it's beyond creepy.
Gives me chills. And that's why we have dogs. That helps, I think.
Well, there wouldn't be anybody standing by our bed listening to us breathe, that's for sure.
No, not with our dogs alive, there wouldn't. But he would say that he liked the feeling it gave him to invade people's homes and violate their privacy. He was definitely mentally disturbed. His biological parents had both suffered from some mental illness.
Do we know what diagnosis they carried?
I've heard bipolar and schizophrenia.
Okay.
But I'm not sure which parent had which. But we know his mom was only 16 when she had him. So the situation was probably not good to begin with.
No, doesn't sound like it.
No. So he was convicted of 12 counts of burglary in late 2002 and sentenced to 9 years in prison. Then he was paroled in April of 2007, just 3 months before the Petit home invasion. According to the laws in Connecticut, the prosecutors were supposed to send the parole board a transcript of the sentencing, where the judge had called him a calculated, cold-blooded predator. But the parole board never received this, so they really weren't aware like they should have been of the details of his crimes.
Yeah, but there's a big difference between your typical B&E criminal and someone with the likes of Kamasarjevsky. I mean, most burglars break into a home while the occupants aren't there.
Right.
But Kamasarjevsky enjoyed the thrill of entering homes while people living there were asleep.
Well, yeah, he had to, because if you really just want to break into homes and take things, there's no reason to do it when people are home.
No. And you do it, you're in and out quickly. You're not standing around listening to people breathing or watching them.
Yeah, so I kind of feel like this sort of incident was doomed to happen eventually with him.
Yeah, I know what you're talking about. You're going to be escalating gradually.
Yeah, I mean, look at Ted Bundy starting out peeking in windows. It's just something we know that happens with these real sickos. But he really enjoyed that thrill of being there while they were asleep, so that's disturbing. And not only did he watch them and listen to their breathing, but there was always this thrill of the possibility that someone would wake up and he'd react to that. So this made him much more dangerous. And of course that would be proven by the brutality of the Petit home invasion.
And Kamasarjevsky had a history of depression. When he was 14 years old, he was sent to Elm Crest Psychiatric Hospital in Portland, Connecticut, after he had committed several crimes, including burglary and arson. Now, while he was hiding from the police in the woods at his grandfather's house, he carved the word hate into his forearm with a hunting knife. And according to court documents, Joshua's parents had hesitantly gone along with court orders to get him psychiatric help.
Yeah, they really didn't believe in it.
Right. I mean, I'd call them zealots. They were religious zealots. And
yeah.
His parents believed that prayer was the solution to Joshua's emotional problems.
Well, yeah, so the way I look at it is, if he was sexually molested by a young man, his adopted brother, and then he's taught in church that the things that he had been forced to do with him were sins, he's thinking that he's evil too. So this is really messing him up.
Well, yeah.
Yeah, he's not getting the type of therapy that maybe could have helped. A lawyer who represented Joshua at the time told the court that the parents had taken their son out of the hospital against medical advice and placed him in a faith program. So the parents believed that antidepressants that the hospital had prescribed for him were just a crutch. So they refused to let him take them.
Then over the next several years, Kamasarjevsky got worse, and his crimes escalated. Now, this isn't meant to be an excuse for his disgusting crimes, but it does paint a picture of someone who desperately needed help as a child and teen and didn't get it. Parents didn't allow him to get the psychiatric help, counseling that he needed. They certainly didn't allow him to take any medication. He was going to have a tough time.
Well, and apparently he did, and he took it out on other people.
He did. After he did get released from prison in 2007, Kamasarjevsky was placed at the Silliman halfway house, and that's where he met career criminal Stephen Hayes. Stephen Hayes, he was born on May 30th, 1983, in Homestead, Florida. He was born to James and Diana Hayes. The school record showed he was placed in special ed classes due to his speech issues, his unruly behavior, and his short attention span. When he was 10 years old, his parents got divorced. He started around that same time taking drugs and drinking alcohol. In his teens, he got into trouble for stealing. He did drop out of high school in his senior year. Somehow he managed to get his GED. But he was in and out of prison his entire life. His two brothers would later say that they knew their brother had a very dark side. He didn't have a record of violence, but his brothers would remember him as a kid who took pleasure in hurting others. Hayes was paroled for the last time in 2006. This is after spending much of his adult life in prison. And that's when he met Kamasarjevsky in the halfway house. Kamasarjevsky didn't stop at the Petit home that evening of July 22nd. He drove past the house. He told his buddy Stephen about the house, and that's going to be their target. They decided they would return that night and burglarize the house. Now, in the meantime, they got ready for doing this. They bought an air rifle and some rope from Walmart. So they were definitely aware that there could be a confrontation in the home, or they planned to attack the family from the beginning. A little unclear which was which, but they were ready. Now, after they did their Walmart shopping, Kamasarjevsky and Hayes went home for a few hours. Kamasarjevsky called his girlfriend up. Her father had moved her to Arkansas, likely to get her away from Kamasarjevsky.
I think it's more than likely. I think the father would even say that to him. Because the girls that he seemed to pick for girlfriends were very young looking, even if they weren't underage. So you could really see the pedophile in him, just from his behavior and the types of girls he picked, really.
Yes. He told his girlfriend that he was going to be coming into a lot of money. He told her $15,000, and this was going to get her back to Connecticut so they could be together. His girlfriend later would describe his demeanor over the phone as jumpy, like he was in a hurry to get somewhere. And Kamasarjevsky and Hayes texted each other several times between Walmart and the home invasion. Hayes sent a text to Kamasarjevsky that read, "I'm chomping at the bit to get started. Need a margarita soon." Then he texted, "We still on?" Kamasarjevsky replied, "Yes." And he also said, "I'm putting the kid to bed. Hold your horses." Now, he was referring to a 5-year-old daughter that he had with an ex-girlfriend.
Yeah, so later on, Hayes would claim that he was just texting about going out and getting drunk. That's all he wanted to do. But most people don't believe that. I don't think I do either.
I wouldn't, unless this is way out of context. It sure sounds like they're talking about invading the home.
Absolutely. And when they get caught, both of them had different stories. They both pretty much blamed each other.
Well, that's what you're supposed to do.
Right.
Hayes replied to Kamasarjevsky saying, "I've just got to get the kid to bed." Hayes responded, "Dude, the horses want to get loose. LOL."
Yeah, so the two men left their homes after midnight. And there are various stories that maybe they went out drinking together, maybe not. But when he left his home, where he lived with his mother, Kamasarjevsky's mother questioned why he was going out so late and wearing dark clothes. And she was concerned. She thought he was up to something.
Well, good reason.
Yes. And he told her he was meeting up with a guy named Steve about a job. Now, I think you could argue that maybe she should have called the police then, because he was on parole. But I don't know what to say about what was in her mind, but I would just think after spending so many years and knowing his behavior, you'd be very concerned.
Yeah, although at the same time, she's a bit in denial, too, at least in terms of his mental state, and so maybe she didn't want to say anything.
Well, no, I think she probably didn't, but I think she's wrong in that, is what I'm saying.
Well, yeah, I know.
So both Joshua and Steve had their own cars, and they met up at the Maplecroft Plaza, parked one of the cars, and drove together to Sorghum Mill Drive. And there they parked in a dark area down the street. The two men entered the Petit home at about 3 a.m. Now the outdoor temperature was in the mid-60s, and they were both wearing dark hooded sweatshirts. And they entered through an unlocked door in the basement. So when they came across Bill Petit in the sunroom, Kamasarjevsky found a bat. Kamasarjevsky used a bat that he'd found in the home to hit Bill in the head 4 or 5 times until he was unconscious. So these were hard hits to the front and the back of his head. He was pretty much gushing blood and had several wounds in his scalp. Now, with Hayes' help, they bound Bill's wrists and ankles with zip ties and rope, and Bill would remember one of them saying that if he moves, they'll put 2 bullets in him, and then they ended up pushing him down into the basement. So I'm just trying to imagine being sound asleep and waking up to someone hitting you in the head with a bat, tying you up, so you're in a lot of pain, you're confused, and now your life is threatened. It's just unimaginable to me how you would even deal with that.
I'm just beyond words. I don't know how you would.
So this left Hayley, Michaela, and Jennifer asleep and alone in their bedrooms. The stairway to the second floor faced the front door. Kamasarjevsky led the way as he and Hayes walked up the carpeted steps. Kamasarjevsky turned the doorknob and pushed open Hayley's door. So she was in there alone, and he crept up beside her bed, with Hayes in the doorway blocking the nightlight from the hall. So we really have no way of knowing what Hayley thought and felt when her eyes opened to this stranger standing over her, but of course she had to be terrified. She didn't struggle, at least then, and actually stayed quite calm. And I guess Kamasarjevsky was very careful with her because he saw her as the strongest and most athletic family member, and he likely knew who she was. The intruders zip-tied Hayley's hands and bound her arms and legs to the bedpost with clothesline that they had found in the basement, too. And they put pillowcases over their heads. So Hayley had a pillowcase over her head, and she's tied up. It was then that Hayley asked, "Why are you doing this?" And he said that he just smiled at her as he pulled the pillowcase over her face. So next, Kamasarjevsky and Hayes walked down the hall to the master bedroom, where Michaela was sleeping with her mom. Both of the men went into the room together this time. Hayes went to Jennifer's side of the bed, and Kamasarjevsky went to Michaela's side. Michaela and Jennifer remained surprisingly calm in this situation. Their hands were bound with zip ties and pillowcases were put over their heads. Then Kamasarjevsky took Michaela out of Jennifer's room and took her to her room to tie her up. So it had only taken about 15 minutes to beat Bill and tie up the whole family. I'm sure he took Michaela to the other room so he could have privacy to do what he wanted with her, which is very disturbing. But Jennifer was hoping that the men would just take some money or whatever they wanted and they would leave.
Yeah, Jennifer was begging them, please don't hurt my family. And Kamasarjevsky assured her they just wanted to rob the place, and they would leave if everyone cooperated. Now, we don't know. It seems that Jennifer believed him, or at least wanted to believe him.
Well, from what she said at the bank, it does seem like she was at least trying to believe that that's what they would do.
Right. Now, the Petit family was just a random target of a couple of deranged and dangerous men who were attracted to their appearance of wealth. Kamasarjevsky was a serial burglar and a pedophile who enjoyed invading occupied homes in the middle of the night. Hayes was a drug addict who had spent most of his adult life in jail for crimes he had committed to support his habit. So the two men together were devastatingly lethal.
Well, they spent close to 6 hours in the Petit home, but they hadn't found as much money as they had wanted or expected to find. Apparently, Jennifer had been offering them jewels and other valuables, but they only wanted money. They did take coins from the family coin jar. They went into Hayley's wallet and took a little over $100 because she still had some of her graduation gifts in her wallet, a couple of gift cards as well. But of course, they weren't satisfied with this. They thought they were going to get a big haul there. They had asked Bill Petit where the safe was, but the family didn't have a safe. They weren't multimillionaires. They did find plastic jugs filled with windshield wiper fluid in the garage, and they emptied them so that Hayes could take Jennifer's car to a gas station and fill them up with gas. So at this point, I don't know if this was planned ahead of time or things had just taken a bad turn because they hadn't found as much as they wanted.
Yeah, but it sounds like they're planning on doing something bad.
Absolutely. They're going to go beyond the violence and the theft. It sounds like they're going to kill people.
Sounds like they're going to do something bad and start a fire.
Yes. But after he left, Hayes couldn't find his way back to the house, and he had to call Kamasarjevsky 3 times for directions. And then Hayes had taken off his latex gloves. So when Kamasarjevsky came down the stairs from Michaela's room, he saw him standing there without the gloves on, and he asked him if he knew what he had touched. And Kamasarjevsky had screamed at him, because Hayes had been all over the house, opening drawers, pawing through cabinets and closets. And when Kamasarjevsky yelled at him, Hayes just shrugged. So it may have been then that he decided to kill the Petits, or they may have planned to all along. He may have even considered killing Hayes at that point. So the men had gone through the house but hadn't found as much money as they'd hoped to find. But then they saw a checkbook with a $40,000 balance. So they decided they'd get $15,000 by taking Jennifer to the bank in the morning. CCTV footage from a gas station captured Hayes purchasing $10 worth of gas and putting it into the plastic jugs. After driving 2 cars to the Maplecroft Plaza, they left one of their cars with some stolen items inside the parking lot. Then they returned to the Petit house in Jennifer's Pacifica.
And she was driving a Mercedes the first time he saw her.
Yes.
Oh, okay.
This was like the family minivan, a Pacifica.
Yeah.
It's a Chrysler. Yeah. So that's what they were driving.
So Kamasarjevsky told Jennifer that if she went with one of them to the bank and withdrew $15,000 for them, she could save her daughter's lives. So presented with that, Jennifer agreed to go with them as soon as the bank opened.
Well, what else is she going to do?
I know.
So really her only option is to hope that this will make them leave.
They told her that if anyone called the police, her husband and children were dead. So just before 9 in the morning, Hayes took Jennifer to the bank.
Yes, now he had a cell phone with him, and he said if she tried anything funny, he would text Kamasarjevsky back at the house, and he would kill the rest of the family.
Yeah.
So she was terrified.
Keep her in line.
Yeah. So outside of that bank, Hayes sat behind the wheel of the Petit's car as the wipers were clearing rain from the windshield because it had begun to rain. And through the bank's front window, he watched Jennifer, making sure that she didn't try and get help. She knew that the lives of her family were at stake, of course, and she'd kept very outwardly calm in the face of such a horrible experience. So she hurried through the rain to the bank, but the front door was still locked. So she had to go back and sit with Hayes for 15 minutes or so, waiting for the bank to open. I guess they were a little bit late opening because of the rain. But of course that 15 minutes in the car with this captor must have felt like hours.
Oh.
And she knows her little girls are home with the other guy.
Right.
So all around them, normal life was going on. It's a Monday morning at the Maplecroft Plaza. Hayes was nervous, and he would giggle a lot when he was nervous. Jennifer likely tried to assure him that everything would work out. She told both of her captors that she understood their motive, that it had never seemed fair to her that some people didn't have to struggle for money while others did. So she was actually showing compassion for their situation, which to me is remarkable. Now, it could have been just an act, but she just seems like the kind of person who was very compassionate. So she told them she'd give them whatever they wanted, and she wouldn't tell anyone. When she finally saw the bank manager open the door, Hayes gave her these final orders and another warning. So she was eager to get into the bank, get the money, and end this nightmare for her family.
So there was a witness. There were several witnesses, but Debbie Biggins was at the bank to open a checking account that morning. And she remembered that the clock in her car read 9:14 a.m. The bank had opened a few minutes late. So Biggins remembered a tall, blonde woman filling out a white slip of paper that she thought was a deposit slip, but she could tell that something was wrong, and she sensed that Jennifer was upset or afraid. And whether or not Jennifer considered staying in the bank and having the teller call the police, we just don't have any way of knowing. But she seemed to believe that the men would leave her family alive if she just gave them the $15,000. She knew her daughters were tied to their beds, and she may have known about the jugs of gas also.
I bet she did. She knew that Kamasarjevsky was in her home with her daughters, and if she didn't come out of that bank, he might hurt them. So I kind of feel like I wouldn't have left the bank because I wouldn't trust them at all, and I just want the police to go right over there. But, she wanted to save her family, and this was her choice. It's not an easy choice to make when you're in that situation, I'm certain.
No, I think she's looking at, the lesser of the two evils. If I go along with them, there's still a possibility that we'll get out of this okay. And if she tries to double-cross them or do anything, her family's going to get killed.
Yeah, I think she really wanted to trust the younger one, Kamasarjevsky, because he looked like kind of an innocent young guy. He didn't look like a monster, but I'm sure she wasn't naive or stupid either, and she understood her family was in a very precarious situation. Now, like we know, Kamasarjevsky had been a very troubled child, and now he's a very dangerous man. In fact, while Jennifer was inside of the bank, he removed 11-year-old Michaela's clothing, and he took photos of her. He also sexually assaulted her and took pictures of himself doing that. He would later claim that his plan was to extort Bill Pettit for more money later on by using naked photos of his younger daughter. He also tried to claim that he thought she was 14 or 16, as if that would make a big difference. But he sexually assaulted the girl. Apparently, he had ejaculated on her, and she wanted to take a shower. So he allowed her to take a shower. She changed her clothing. He tied her back up, and when Hayes returned, he saw that she had wet hair and her clothes had changed. So I'm not sure what he thought of that, what the discussion was, but we do know that Kamasarjevsky sexually assaulted this little girl.
Now, although the bank had just opened, there was a pretty good crowd there already. Probably 20 people were in line. There was a person at customer service, and a couple more were using the ATM. Sitting in the car, Steve Hayes watched Jennifer to see if she was reporting him. He felt that he had to let her go in alone. There were cameras, plus he would look out of place anyway. So Jennifer had agreed to withdraw the $15,000 and come right back to the car. There was a long wait in the line. Jennifer was shaking with fear and nervousness from what the witnesses said. She finally decided to cut in line. Now, nobody said anything about it, probably because she looked like it was urgent. The other customers could clearly see something's wrong with this poor woman.
Yes. So she did go up to the teller and slid a small piece of paper through the slot, and the combination of her really grim demeanor and the withdrawal of so much cash certainly would have been a red flag all on its own. But then the note she had written confirmed that there was a serious issue. The teller read the message Jennifer had written on the slip. It read, "I need to take $15,000 out of my savings account in cash. I have to have the money because my family is being held hostage, and if the police are notified, my family will be killed." Now, I guess there was kind of an issue because it was a joint account, and to take out that money, she really should have had Bill with her co-signing. But when they read this note, they decided to go ahead and give her the money and then call the police. So the teller gave Jennifer the cash. Then she took the note to the bank manager. So at first, the manager sees the note and thinks the bank was being robbed. And after seeing the note, the manager called the police. And the call came in at 9:21 a.m. And that is the recording that we played in our introduction. She told the police that one of her customers seemed to be taking out cash under duress. She was put on hold and then asked to give a full description of what had happened. So there was a kind of a delay there. It took 5 minutes then before the call went out to patrol officers. This was at 9:26 a.m. And they were given Jennifer's name and her home address. Jennifer, of course, was back in the car with Hayes by then, heading back to her house. But police didn't intercept them, which I think they definitely could have. There were police out on patrol around that area.
Yeah, they could have.
Now, normally, neighbors would be out walking their dogs and running and doing things, but it was too rainy, so the neighborhood was pretty quiet still.
Yeah, and at that time, there was a Cheshire police cruiser on Higgins Road, which was a minute or two from the Pettit home. The drive from the Bank of America to the Pettit home took about 7 minutes. So the cruiser should have been at 300 Sorghum Mill Drive, just before or at the same time that Jennifer and Steve Hayes returned to the home. But for some reason, the cruiser wasn't there. In the transcript of a second call, when the bank manager was told to call police headquarters, is in the public record. And this document shows the radio communication between Cheshire Police and the dispatcher. This covers a time period of about 35 minutes.
Yeah, so at 9:34 a.m., we have the first mention of the Pettit address along with the words HQ to all units. Then just moments later, several other police vehicles, including cruisers and unmarked cars, were speeding toward Sorghum Mill Drive. Interactions between police and dispatch were numerous. At 9:36, a uniformed officer was out of his vehicle and approaching the property on foot from Hotchkiss Ridge, a small road that looped behind the Pettit home. Thinking that he might have arrived at the location before Jennifer and the captor in the Pacifica, the officer radioed the house number and description to see if other cars were arriving. And at this point, he's literally in the Pettit's backyard.
From 9:36 to 9:42, the shift commander, along with the dispatcher, directed cruisers to the Bank of America branch, and they coordinated roadblocks on Sorghum Mill Drive. An officer at headquarters was asked to bring a bag of his gear out to the location. Now, there are several mentions about gear, rifles, helmets, etc., and how they could be delivered to the scene. Inside the house, neither Kamasarjevsky nor Hayes were aware that the police were there. At this point, they'd been in the Pettit home for almost 7 hours. Kamasarjevsky was upstairs when he heard Hayes come into the house with Jennifer, and he checked on Hayley, and then he went downstairs.
So at 9:42, police realized that the Pacifica was parked in the driveway at 300 Sorghum Mill Drive. Meanwhile, police cruisers and unmarked cars continued to rush out to the house. The shift commander was asked if the special response team van should be fired up, and the answer was yes. Cheshire's SWAT team was on the way. Roadblocks on Sorghum Mill were set up a couple of hundred yards to the south of the Pettit home and about the same distance to the north. At 9:44 a.m., an officer requested permission to try and make contact with the Pettit house. He actually had 2 phone numbers. But according to the Hartford Courant, no calls to the house were made, and no one knocked on the door either. So no one tried to make contact. To me, I'm thinking, why not a bullhorn? But it seems like they were setting up for kind of a standoff that was going to last a while, and they were just totally caught off guard by what occurred.
Yeah, I think they're not sure what exactly is the situation in the house, right?
Well, they know that the family's held captive, but they don't know if they have guns or any of that.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So I can see where they want to make sure that they got things set up properly.
Yeah, I mean, that's part of the tragedy, is that everything happens so fast. Whether you blame the police or not, it's definitely part of the tragedy here.
Yeah, in that same radio transmission, the officer said he had the state police helicopter willing to go up in the air. And that same officer said he had ordered the helicopter into the air just in case. The officer on foot behind the Petit home asked if he could approach the house. And the response he got was, "Look, hold off on the contact. I just want to see if the garage is open or anything like that. I just want to make sure we have enough bodies before we start making contact."
So that all sounds pretty reasonable. But then just looking how this all went down, it's hard not to say, why didn't they do something sooner? So Kamasarjevsky would later say that he stood on the stairs and watched as Jennifer Petit begged Hayes for her life. "Please don't kill me," she was begging, as Hayes' hands were clamped around her neck. So according to Kamasarjevsky, Hayes raped and strangled Jennifer, and he left her body propped against a couch with her clothing ripped. Now, Hayes would later say that Kamasarjevsky ordered him to do this to square things up because he had already sexually assaulted Michaela and possibly Hayley. But DNA testing after events would show that Hayes did rape Jennifer. Now, at 9:55 a.m., there were at least a dozen emergency vehicles in that area. Most were police cars, both cruisers and unmarked cars. More officers, some of them carrying rifles and shotguns, took positions around the house. They followed protocol and they did secure the perimeter. No one outside of the house knew that Jennifer Petit was already dead.
Then Bill Petit staggered out of the back bulkhead door of the basement into the backyard. Disoriented, he's bruised, he's bleeding, and his feet are still bound.
Yeah, so he had to hop up the stairs and then roll across the yard to go to his neighbor's.
That's amazing.
Where he banged on the garage door until the neighbor finally heard him and came out and didn't recognize him. So that's how beat up he was, covered in blood.
Yeah, he lost quite a bit of blood.
Yeah, 7 pints, I think I heard, which is barely survivable. I've never heard of so much blood being lost.
Yeah.
The body holds, 12?
Yeah, on average.
He's a bigger guy, but still, yeah, crazy amount.
Well, 50% of his blood volume.
Yeah, so it's amazing he could even do that.
Yeah.
So by then, the fumes from gasoline permeated the house. Then a match was lit and the house ignited with a boom. Of course, each killer would say that the other one lit the match.
A neighbor heard screams coming from inside the Petit house. 911 calls began to come in reporting the fire. Unaware the police were surrounding his house, Bill was trying to get to the neighbors and tell them to call 911. Now, he had just reached the next-door neighbor's house before collapsing. Neighbor heard Bill shouting, and he called 911. Then the home invaders heard the shouts and looked out of an upstairs window, and that's when they poured gasoline onto Jennifer's body and onto Hayley and Michaela, who were still alive and bound to their beds. Kamasarjevsky and Hayes were thinking, they can get away with this if they burned the house down. So after the home was ablaze, the two ran out the front door, jumped into Jennifer's car. It's 9:58, and police outside could hear screams coming from upstairs.
So this is just a nightmare. It's so horrible.
Can't even imagine how
Those
terrifying.
Poor girls.
Yeah.
My God. So Bill Petit, covered in his own blood, was still conscious, amazingly. And he told the police that his wife and 2 daughters were still inside of the house. He had heard the screaming and he was begging them to hurry up and save them. And he explained that they'd been victims of a home invasion. Police who were located near the Petit driveway saw the 2 murderers exit the house and get into the Petit's car. They backed out of the driveway as police ordered them to stop, and they drove recklessly down the street and hit a police cruiser. Then, at a roadblock further down the street, they crashed into 2 police cars that were parked nose to nose. But this impact caused the airbags of the Pacifica to deploy, and the car was no longer drivable. So police were able to pull the 2 men out of the car. Kamasarjevsky had been driving, both men were on parole, and both men just reeked of gasoline.
So as these guys are taken into custody, the house continued to burn. The screaming had stopped. Fire department arrived, and the fire was extinguished at 10:01 a.m. 31 minutes since the bank manager's 911 call. Bill Petit was taken to the hospital. Inside the house, firemen found 3 dead bodies. The plastic containers that had held the gas were inside, partially melted. Homicide detectives and the county medical examiner were called to the scene. By this time it's noon, pouring down rain. They roped off the property, set up a tent in the middle of the street. Inside the Petit's Pacifica, police found a black winter hat with eye holes cut in it, 5 latex gloves, 2 cotton gloves, and a bunch of plastic zip ties.
So I'm just going to say, if they wanted to go in there and get money and leave, there's no reason to have all of these items with them. None at all.
Nope.
Kamasarjevsky's car, a Chevy Venture, was found in a parking lot 1.5 miles away, and it was just down the street from the gas station where the jugs had been filled. Inside of his car, they found 9 pairs of latex gloves, 2 rubber gloves, an open package of cable ties, and a brown shirt which appeared to have eye holes cut into it. Hayes' car was parked in the Stop and Shop parking lot. Hayley and Bill Petit's wallets were found inside of that car. At the hospital, Bill Petit was told that his family had all died, and he felt horrible, and he actually apologized to Jennifer's parents for not saving their daughter and their granddaughters. He felt a lot of guilt for being the only survivor, but he was in horrible shape. There's no way he could have gotten upstairs and saved them or fought these men off. He was severely injured, he'd lost half of his blood, and he was tied up. So he really did the best thing I could think of doing, which is to go get help. It's amazing that he was even able to do that.
Yeah, given the severity of his condition, it's amazing that he did as much as he was able to do.
It is, yeah. But at least early on, he really had wished that he wasn't the only survivor because of how miserable and horrible this whole thing was. And he's lost his whole family in the worst way imaginable, really.
Mm-hmm. The police held a press conference at the Cheshire Police Department. Connecticut State Police Lieutenant Vance spoke, going over the events of the morning. But there were some significant omissions. Vance claimed that the first responding officers noted upon arriving the house was on fire and men were trying to escape. He didn't mention the 5-minute gap between the 911 call from the bank and the order for officers to go to the Petit home, or the 26-minute gap between when officers arrived at the property and when they took any action.
So the Petit home was taken over by crime scene investigators who worked alongside the State Police Fire Marshal Unit and Major Crime Squad investigators. Jennifer's body had the remnants of a nylon material burnt in the back of her neck and charred rope in the area of her ankles. There was also rope-like material on Hayley and Michaela's ankles. They also found the same rope-like material tied to the girls' bedposts. Both of the girls' beds had gas poured on them, and they both had died from smoke inhalation. Michaela had died still bound to her bed, but Hayley was not found tied to her bed, but on the second-floor landing. Hayley had escaped her ties, and she had died outside of her sister Michaela's bedroom. It seems that she was trying to go and save her little sister, actually. So the cause of the fire, of course, was arson, and the fire marshal identified accelerant pour patterns throughout the house. Bill Petit was treated for his injuries and released from the hospital 4 days later, just in time to attend the funeral of his wife and his 2 daughters. Search warrants to search the bodies of Kamasarjevsky and Hayes let investigators test for blood, saliva, semen, hairs, other secretions, fingerprints, palm prints, fibers, and accelerants. And this was to find evidence that the 2 men had been in contact with the Petit family members, especially to confirm the sexual assaults that had taken place there.
Now, the Petits were pretty well known and liked throughout the community. Grief counselors were assigned to the 2 girls' schools and to the parents' workplaces. Both of the suspects were held on $15 million bond. Their cases were moved to the New Haven Superior Court. State officials announced that they were re-examining policies regarding repeat offenders being released into the community on parole. Both suspects had very lengthy criminal histories, but both had been released from prison because they had no history of violence.
Well, that's what a lot of people would say, is they had no violence on their records, and they were both employed, So there were really no red flags at that point.
Well, yeah, but there's still a lot of people who were of the belief that a person who would break into homes in the middle of the night would know that the possibility of violence was there.
Absolutely. And I think especially Kamasarjevsky was looking for that.
Yes.
I think so, yes. Now, after these murders, many residents went out and bought home security systems and guns. Capitalizing on this fear, ADT Security Services passed out brochures in Cheshire neighborhoods. Though fear and shock were pervasive throughout the state of Connecticut, they weren't the only feelings that were shared by people in reaction to these murders. Both online and in the media, some people questioned the actions of Dr. Petit, wondering why he had been the only one to make it out alive. And of course that was going to happen. That's just people are always looking for someone to blame, which they already had 2 people to blame for sure, but they still were looking for that.
Oh, sure.
But he'd actually been on a blood thinner at the time, and like I said, he'd lost about 7 pints of blood, which you would normally have like 12 pints, right? So over half of his blood supply.
More than half of his blood volume.
So when you're bleeding out, you definitely lose strength, you can lose consciousness, you can't function.
I would think that it's almost a miracle that he was able to do what he did with that much of blood loss.
Well, even giving a pint of blood for blood donation, I've gotten lightheaded. So I can't imagine losing half your blood supply, how you would be able to do anything.
Right.
Plus imagine just the searing pain after you've been beaten in the head with a baseball bat repeatedly.
Yeah.
He had several large gashes on his head. But, his appearance at the memorial services ended most suspicions. You could tell he was devastated. Hundreds of friends, acquaintances, and patients of the doctor gathered in front of his Plainville office for a candlelight vigil. But if that memorial was difficult, the gathering of high school friends and long-term patients was just an overwhelming expression of grief, especially for those 2 girls. And over 2,000 people attended.
And the murders, as sensational as they were, made national news. Some people compared it to the Clutter family murders in 1959. Those were written about in Truman Capote's book, In Cold Blood. Now, Clint Van Zandt of MSNBC News, who's a former FBI profiler, said that the Petit murders reminded him of the New Year's Day 2006 murder of the Harvey family in Richmond, Virginia. Now, in that case, 2 burglars had entered the family home through an open door. They murdered the 2 parents and the 2 daughters. The victims had been beaten to death with a hammer, and their throats had been slit. And although some didn't think motivation was important, Van Zandt said that it's important to understand the motivation of killers to help us to understand the psychology of people who commit such crimes.
Sure.
Now, in the case of the Petits, Van Zandt believed it was a perfect storm of 2 sociopaths who goaded each other on. And they also both had a long history of drug use.
Yeah, especially Hayes, who was in his 40s and had been using drugs since his teens. But most people did believe that Kamasarjevsky was the ringleader. Not to say that Hayes was any less guilty, because he did horrible things too. And they both blamed each other. Now, one of Kamasarjevsky's previous burglary victims from 2002 had been living in Burlington when Kamasarjevsky entered through a cellar door of his home, stole some electronics and a very large knife. He learned later that Kamasarjevsky had been watching his home for days before he entered it. And he was really unsettled to realize that if he or his wife had woken up and seen him, they certainly may have suffered a similar fate to the Petits. The Petit home was actually the 3rd home broken into by these guys that weekend. So as soon as Kamasarjevsky's electronic monitor had been removed, he'd gone right away out on a burglary spree, and he'd taken Hayes with him.
On Thursday, July 26th, the Petit family released a statement thanking the community for their support. That same day, both suspects were charged with multiple counts of assault, sexual assault, arson, burglary, kidnapping, and murder. The state's attorney announced that he planned to seek the death penalty for both men. But even if convicted and sentenced to death, it wasn't likely that either would be put to death. There were 7 inmates on Connecticut's death row at the time, but in the past 47 years, only 1 prisoner had been executed, and this was serial killer Michael Bruce Ross. He was executed in 2005.
Yes, so as a person who generally does not believe in the death penalty, there's no way I could ever blame this family for wanting that.
No.
No, I think in that situation, everything changes, really. So they did want that. The Cheshire community, as well as people across the country, really had a lot of trouble dealing with the aftermath of the Petit family murders. In response to this, ABC News actually put out safety recommendations for homeowners on their website. And these recommendations included that if you have children, you should have 2 peepholes in your front door, one for adults to look through and one that the kids can look through. Also, that if you have a home alarm, it should make a very loud noise, loud enough to awaken everyone and to scare the burglar away. Also, windows should be secured, because when home invaders break into windows, it's usually because they're unlocked. Now, in the case of the Petits, their basement door was unlocked. If you're not in a safe place, they can get to you, it said on the website, so it suggested turning a closet into a safe room by putting a deadlock on the door, putting a light inside, and keeping a cell phone in there, which I think that's a great idea. Also, they suggested that you keep your house lit even when you're not home. Those timers that have the lights come on and off at certain times are a very good thing to have as well.
And then in February of 2008, the police department held a seminar to help residents learn how to avoid becoming a victim of a crime. So in that seminar, they discouraged people from keeping a spare key in a fake rocker under a planter. Well, yeah, that's where they'd look.
Yes.
They discouraged keeping a gun in the house, and they shared the statistic that guns in the home are 22 times more likely to be used for something other than self-defense. And the police response to the murders on Sorghum Hill Drive, well, I would only echo the gun in the house. I'll confess, I don't like guns.
Well, no, we're both very anti-gun.
But the statistic that you're way more likely to be doing something with a gun other than self-defense, yeah.
Well, yeah, kids can get into it. There are accidents.
Yeah, I just think there's too many things that can go wrong with a gun.
Yeah, I could never sleep with a gun in my house. So, to me, I'd try everything else.
So the police response to the murders on Sorghum Mill Drive was widely scrutinized, and the Cheshire Police Department found they had to defend themselves. The police department officers acted properly and according to their training, said the spokesperson. The Cheshire town manager praised the way his department had handled the crime, saying without their great work, this could have been a far worse tragedy.
Yeah, I don't get that. I mean, it's really hard for me to imagine how much worse this could have gotten.
Yeah, I guess...
What does he mean by that?
The only other thing would be for Dr. Petit to have been killed also.
I know, but I'm sure when this all happened, he would have rather been killed than survive all this, at least in the moment. And I just don't see... I think that statement is just kind of thoughtless. I don't like that statement. You know, at least 20 minutes passed between the time the first Cheshire police officer was on foot in the Petit's backyard and when the Pacifica crashed into the police barricade. And neighbors had heard screams coming from the Petit home while the police were still setting up perimeters. So I think there's a problem there. I don't want to point fingers at the police, but I really think that mistakes were made that should be acknowledged and fixed. Certainly these police officers were not prepared for this sort of thing as far as having any experience with it. This was a good neighborhood.
Yeah.
So I understand that, but I think you need to take responsibility for the mistakes that were made.
Definitely.
And the Petit family really believes that. Now, Michaela or Hayley, or both of them, were alive while Cheshire police were in their backyard, supposedly following procedure. On the first anniversary of the murders, Jennifer Hawke-Petit's parents, the Reverend Richard and Mary Bell Hawke, broke their silence in the press with a really critical assessment of that police response. So a letter they wrote to the prosecutor read in part, "We indeed are victims of the silence, and we have been very disturbed with the untruthfulness to protect the negligence of action to intervene in this home invasion. They could have stopped the murders." The Hawke sentiments were shared in blog entries that called the Cheshire Police Keystone Cops and Barney Fife. The harshness of that assessment was probably unfair, No one really could have imagined what was going on in that home, but there were definitely no heroes outside that home that morning. Nobody was really going out on a limb. Of course, they were following orders, so I don't know. But it definitely wasn't handled in the best way possible. Cheshire Police Chief Michael Cruz said that they were not used to this type of event, which I understand, but they should be prepared for that, especially considering that they knew intruders were in the home holding family members hostage. They knew that from the call from the bank.
Yeah, well, you always expect that you should be prepared for these things, right?
Yeah, even if it's not something that commonly happens, of course, you still need to be prepared. Well, what if this does happen?
Right. Well, here's an example from a medical aspect.
Okay.
Every couple years we take a course in pediatric resuscitation. The likelihood of having to actually resuscitate a baby or a young child is pretty tiny, but it does exist. And you take these classes to remain up to date on how to approach them.
Well, yeah, because when something like that happens, you do need to know how to deal with it.
And you got to know quickly.
Yes.
So that's what I think. I mean, they're not used to this type of event. Who is, for that matter?
Yeah.
But you got to be ready.
That's true. Well, just the whole idea that they could hear screams as the police were still setting up perimeters is disturbing.
Yeah, I mean, we'll never know the whole story.
No, we won't. But surprisingly, Dr. Petit publicly thanked the Cheshire Police Department for their help, and he never publicly criticized them. Which you have to think that it's Kamasarjevsky and Hayes that are responsible for this. But still, I think the police department made mistakes, and they should at least acknowledge that. Not meaning they're responsible for the deaths, but that it could have been handled better.
Yes. So Hayes and Kamasarjevsky offered to plead guilty in exchange for life in prison without parole. But prosecutors rejected the offer. They wanted the death penalty for both of them. So Hayes' trial began September 13th, 2010. Prosecutors argued that both men shared responsibility for the crime, while his defense attorneys argued that his co-conspirator, Kamasarjevsky, was the mastermind of the home invasion and that he was responsible for escalating the violence at each point. I don't imagine that argument's going to get you very far.
No. I mean, they're both very guilty.
So, and after just 5 hours of deliberation, Hayes was convicted on all counts, and his sentencing trial began in October. Defense attorney Thomas Ullman told the jury that a sentence of life in prison was the harshest punishment because he would spend the rest of his life alone in a cell, tormented by what he had done, and his attorney called this a fate worse than death.
Well, sure, but do we really know that this man would be tormented for the rest of his life? Someone who could do this has a real issue with taking responsibility for anything. But at the same time, the death penalty probably isn't going to accomplish anything. On November 8th, the jury returned with a recommendation that he be executed, and the death penalty was recommended on each of his 6 capital felony counts. So he was given an execution date for May 27th, 2011, but that was really just a formality. There are automatic appeals, and his execution could take decades. Then Kamasarjevsky's trial began on September 19th, 2011. His defense attorneys put the blame onto Hayes, arguing that Hayes was the mastermind of the crimes and that Kamasarjevsky was just a confused young man who was easily influenced and really had no intention to kill anyone. So that wasn't going to fly either. Although he admitted to participating in the crime, he insisted he never wanted to kill anyone.
Well, that's a lovely statement. It's all bull.
Yes.
But Kamasarjevsky was found guilty of his crimes, and he was sentenced in January 2012 to death by lethal injection, just as Hayes had been. His execution was scheduled for July 20th, 2012.
So in August of 2015, both death sentences were turned into life sentences with no parole, and this was after the state of Connecticut abolished the death penalty for being in violation of the state's constitution. But the Petit family members did lead a public outcry for reforms in Connecticut's criminal justice system. Connecticut's criminal justice reform package of 2008 was enacted 6 months after the murders of Michaela, Hayley, and Jennifer Petit. It was considered as a public response to the crime because the accused killers were chronic repeat offenders. And they still got out after committing so many crimes. Should they ever have been free in the first place? I don't think so. But these laws did make some improvements in the system, especially with probation and parole. New laws that target home invasion burglaries and robberies have been used by prosecutors to win other long prison terms for offenders. And pieces of the bill included a new statewide criminal information sharing system and the addition of 6 new prosecutors to focus on repeat offenders. But they've been delayed due to funding reductions. So the reforms required a commitment of $27.4 million a year. But in 2009 and 2010, $41.7 million in total was spent. So $13.1 million, or 24% of the money, was taken away from the reform programs just in those 2 years.
HBO had a documentary in 2013 about the Cheshire Murders, and they showed footage from the time of the murders, which included CCTV footage of Jennifer Hawke-Petit inside the bank. Now, a friend of the family calls that night Cheshire's 9/11 because life was never the same afterwards.
I can imagine that.
Yeah. Absolutely.
These were pretty laid-back people if they were leaving doors unlocked, and this was a really horrible wake-up call. Now, they tore the Petit home down 10 months after the murders, and landscapers moved trees and shrubs from the property to a memorial garden that they built on Bill Petit's father's property, and that's where Bill had been living after the tragedy. Bill Petit fought for his family's killers to get the death penalty and became a big supporter of capital punishment. He also started a charitable foundation in honor of his wife and daughters. The goal is to raise funds for the education of young people and to improve the lives of those affected by chronic illnesses and affected by violence. The foundation gives scholarships to needy individuals and makes contributions to charitable and educational institutions. The foundation sells merchandise, including 4 o'clock flower seeds, and the sale of these flower seeds is part of Michaela's Garden Project, which was designed to encourage area families, especially young people, to become more involved in community service. Because really, these 2 girls were very involved in that.
Bill Petit remarried a few years after his family was killed, and he and his wife have a child together. What he's gone through, though, I just cannot imagine. So I'm happy that he could recover some joy in his life.
He deserves it because, this will never go away.
Never.
So if he can find any joy, definitely.
Yes.
Yeah. So our new music was produced by Mike McClellan, and you can find out more about his work by going to his website, podcastps.com. If you have comments, a case suggestion, or a beer recommendation to share with us, please send us an email to truecrimebrewery@tiegrabber.com, or even better, leave us a voicemail. I'll make sure to put a direct link in our show notes for you to click on so you can record your voicemail for a future show. If you're interested in supporting our show and in getting our episodes ad-free, plus getting a special members-only episode each and every month, please go to tiegrabber.com and look at our subscribing options. Subscribing is very inexpensive. 1 month costs you less than a cup of coffee, as they say. And there are over 150 shows in our members-only TCB Premium show. You have the option of subscribing through Patreon, too, by going to patreon.com/tiegrabber. Either way, you'll get your own personal subscription link that you can paste into your podcast app, so you can listen there as well as on our website without any commercials or promos. So that means you won't have to listen to this spiel anymore either. Is it worth it?
Well, sure.
I think so, too.
It's time for listener feedback.
So we've got some great feedback, I hear. What have we got today, Dickie?
The first voicemail is from Tammy.
Hi, Dick and Jill. My name's Tammy Christie, and I live in a small town called Franklin, Ohio, about 38 miles north of Cincinnati. I just wanted to let you know that I love your podcast. I've been listening to y'all for a couple years now. I don't think there's any episode in your archives or current that I've missed. I wanted to give you a case that happened in Blanchester, Ohio, in August of 1996. A young girl named Carrie Culbertson went missing. She had been playing volleyball for someone in her community. She played on a volleyball team, and she went missing, and it's said to be thought that her boyfriend, I believe his name was Robert Doan, D-O-A-N, they had had a very tumultuous relationship. He was very abusive to her. He was later arrested and convicted of her murder, but her body has never been found. Her mother has just been going through it for so many years now, just begging him to let her know where she is. I also believe it was thought that his father and brother also knew what had happened and helped him get rid of the body. So if you could check into that. That was in Blanchester, Ohio, 1996. Love your podcast. Think you two are great together. Your knowledge and the way you feed off of each other is just wonderful. And I don't know much about beer. I drink some wine and some vodka every once in a while, but Dick sure makes them sound great with all the vanilla and caramel and coffee taste and stuff. So just recommend whatever kind of beer you can find from Ohio. And I appreciate your time, and I appreciate all your hard work. And I look forward to keeping on listening to you for several more years. Thank you.
Well, wow. Thanks, Tammy.
You like that one, huh?
I think she's very kind to us.
She certainly is. So this is a tough case. As Tammy said, they've never found the body. They've never found her car that she disappeared in.
And what's her name? Because we've had a couple of people ask to spell out these names so they can look into it.
Yeah, her name is Carrie Culbertson.
With a K?
C.
Okay, will you spell her last name?
Culberson.
Okay, thanks.
And the Carrie, Clarissa, is her name. Yeah, and her boyfriend is a real piece of work. Not too long before she disappeared, he struck her in the head with something or other. She needed 5 staples.
Ooh.
To close that up.
Well, there's proof right there. It was an abusive situation.
Yeah, and there's other examples of abuse. And Tammy also raised the point that the guy's father, and I think it's a half-brother, but he had family members that have likely been involved in disposing of the body.
Now that, to me, is really something. Whenever I hear that a friend or a family member helps to cover something like this up, my mind is blown.
No kidding.
I don't care if it was one of my children or you, someone I really love. I'm sorry, I would still tell. If someone commits murder, I'm out.
Uh-huh.
And I think that's kind of the contract in being in society. That's your role. You don't cover up for that no matter who does it. You can support the person. You can get them an attorney. You can be understanding even, but
you don't help them.
You don't help them get rid of a body or anything. That's just dreadful.
Yeah.
I think that's one of the worst things you can do.
Oh, we will look into this.
Yeah, it reminds me of another case I'd been reading about, and I don't remember the names on it or anything, but it was about a young man who'd killed a girlfriend or a wife, and his mother had helped him cover it up. So
yeah,
that's something else I was looking into. So we'll look into this case as well, because that, to me, is just really shitty. It's one of the shittiest things ever.
The bad move.
Absolutely. Okay, what's our next voicemail?
Another voicemail is from April, and she also has a case suggestion.
Hi, Jill. Hi, Dick. This is April, and I have a case suggestion for you today. I have 2, but the second one I think will have to wait for another voicemail another time. Matthew Shepard was 21 years old in 1998 when 2 men offered him a ride home from the Fireside Lounge in Laramie, Wyoming. But instead of driving him home, they drove him to a rural country road where they beat him and tortured him. Then they tied him to a barbed wire fence and left him unconscious and bloody in the cold night. The passerby who found him initially mistook him for a scarecrow. Matt's attackers drove back into town and immediately picked another fight. Brilliant. Officers responding to this disturbance found blood, Matt's shoes, a bloody gun, and Matt's ID in their truck. So Aaron McKinney and Russell Henderson were quickly linked to his atrocious crime. The first officer on the scene had run out of medical gloves, so she cleared an airway through the blood in Matt's mouth with bare hands. The next day, she was informed that Matt Shepard was HIV positive. At that time, 98, that was a big deal, and there was a lot of prejudice against people who were HIV positive. So it wasn't a very great way to get the cops on your side, I suppose. Matt was gay. Anti-gay protesters picketed Matt's funeral carrying signs that claimed "God hates fags" and "Matt in hell." Some of Matt's friends immediately called his attack out as a hate crime. One of the offenders, Aaron McKinney, tried to use a gay panic defense, claiming that Matt had made a sexual advance, and this drove McKinney into a state of temporary insanity. If I remember correctly, in 1998, in little-town conservative Wyoming, rejection of this defense wasn't a sure thing, not by a long shot. I do believe I remember myself and some of my friends discussing it, really unsure how it would go down. Matthew Shepard's murder spurred forward the movement to protect LGBTQ plus individuals under hate crime legislation. There were plays, films, books, and even songs and albums written about this, and I think recently Matt's posthumously been awarded some honors. Yeah, way too much to list here. Anyway, I've probably run out my 3 minutes. And, 2:39, how about that? So I would love to know more about the personal relationships in this story, and I think that the whole story is well deserving of some of your time. There's tons of stuff out there. I hope to hear you do it sometime. Have a great night, guys. Thank you for what you do.
Thank you so much, April. So I actually have a book about this case that I just have not yet been able to bring myself to read.
Yeah, we've talked about this case before.
We have.
And we've always ended up saying we really should do an episode on it. And with April's voicemail, I said, okay, this is a good time to bring this up again.
Yeah, I think the voicemail is just the nudge we need to actually go ahead and cover this case. Just the hate crime aspect is a big thing. And thinking back to what HIV positive people went through in the 80s and 90s, even children who were hemophiliacs were treated horribly. And then the whole anti-gay movement, which unfortunately is still going on. Look at Florida. They just signed a law. It's really horrific. And then I think even bigger now are crimes against transgender, especially transgender women of color. So I'm going to go ahead and read that book on Matthew Shepard's life.
Okay.
So thanks a lot, April. That was really a great one to bring to our attention.
And we have one more. This is an email from Ellie.
Okay, Ellie writes, first of all, thank you for your wonderful podcasts. Aw, shucks. Thanks, Ellie. On a good day, they make me smile, and on the bad days, they keep me company, and I feel like I'm listening to old friends. I recently heard about the case of Dr. William Husel, an anesthesiologist who's currently on trial for killing 14 patients. His defense attorney is arguing that Husel was only alleviating suffering, but according to testimony seen so far, his dosages were just outrageous. Because of your medical backgrounds, I thought of you two as soon as I heard of this case. I think you could do an excellent job presenting the case and explaining it in a respectful and intelligent way. I hope you will look into it and share your thoughts once the trial is over. So when I read this email, I did go on YouTube and watch some of the trial because, of course, these medical cases really fascinate us. They usually catch my attention. And I was thinking, was he alleviating suffering? Were these people who were going to die anyway? And it seems like that really isn't the case. Of course, many people who are intubated and in the ICU, which I believe all of his victims were, will not survive. But some people do. During COVID, many people came off of the ventilator and survived. Now, these were different cases with infections, drug overdoses, all sorts of different diagnoses. But when you hear about the dosages, Ellie is right. The dosages are outrageous. Hundreds of times. Yes. And prematurely taking them off the ventilator as well. I think it was today that the prosecution rested, and I was reading an article about that. And, it's not a good sign when your fellow medical colleagues are testifying against you.
That's never a good sign.
Now, my only question that I don't know the answer to right now is, did he physically give all of these doses, or did he order some of them and the ICU nurses gave them? Because if I remember all the way back to when I was in nursing school, we were always told, no matter what the doctor orders, you're responsible for what you give. If you question it at all, you don't give it.
That's correct.
Right? So I wonder about that. So I will definitely be following that. And yes, I think as soon as the trial is over, it should definitely be a True Crime Brewery episode.
Yes, we will do that. And that's all we got for today, Jill.
Okay. Well, I just want to thank everyone for listening. I hope you like our new music, and we will see you next time at the Quiet End.
Come on down. Got plenty of seats.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye, guys.